Hello there, fellow cylinder enjoyers. Today I wanted to talk about... Actually, cylinder enjoyer sounds quite suspect. Whatever, let's move past it. Today I wanted to talk about O'Neill cylinders, or really just cylindrical space habitats in general. They're such a cool idea, and there's kind of a lot of different ways that you can configure them. These are a really diverse category of space station, despite the fact that just the concept of a rotating cylinder seems kind of limiting at first glance. It really isn't. There's a lot to these, and they're really cool, so let's talk about it. Okay, so for the uninitiated, an O'Neill cylinder is it's basically a giant floating Pringles tube in space. The idea behind it is that since there's no gravity in space, well, actually, technically that's not true. If you're right next to the Earth, you're going to get pulled down to the Earth because the Earth has gravity, and there's gravity from lots of different sources, like the moon pulls on you, the Earth pulls on you, the sun pulls on you, all the other planets pull on you. But really, the situation is that you're in free fall. All those different forces add up to some certain direction that they're pulling you in. The gravitational force acts on all of the atoms in your body, and they add up to pull you in a certain direction, and that's the direction in which you're falling. But if you're in a room, right, if you're in a spacecraft or in a space station or whatever, it is also getting pulled in the same direction. So you and everything around you is all falling in the same direction, which gives the impression that there's no gravity, right? Because everything's weightless. This is the situation that you see in the International Space Station, right? Everything floats because the entire space station is falling around the planet. Now, fun as this effect is, it is kind of inconvenient for getting from place to place. If there's no gravity and you end up stationary in the middle of a room, you're just kind of stuck there. Much as it feels like you should be able to do the backstroke through the air, it doesn't actually work in practice. So ideally what we want is a way to make artificial gravity. In sci-fi, they do this by just flipping a switch and everyone sticks to the floor for some reason. That doesn't really work in reality. If you did things like they do them in The Expanse, where you just have an engine on continuously, then you can stand up against the floor while the engine's on because the whole ship is accelerating into the bottom of your feet. But in reality, engines that powerful and that efficient just don't exist. One way to get around it, which was also in The Expanse, is to have magnetic boots, so you can kind of stick to the ground. Although you are still floating inside of the boots, like the mass of your body is not being compressed through the soles of your feet into the floor. Everything's still basically floating. The one actually practical way to make artificial gravity is to have a container and spin it. And there's a few ways to set this up. You can have a cable with a room at each end, or maybe a room on one end and a counterweight on the other, and just spin the whole thing, and then people in the room can stand up. Or you can have like a donut shape called a torus. Those are cool as well. But if you want to maximize internal area, you can just have a continuous volume that's spinning, which, if you think about it, would look like a cylinder. People sometimes wonder why you wouldn't make it a sphere. You could make a sphere and rotate it and have this whole centrifugal gravity thing work, but it would only work along the equator in relation to the orientation that it's spinning in. If you tried to walk to any part of the inside of this sphere that wasn't on the equator of the spin, it would increasingly feel like you're walking uphill until at the poles, it'd be like trying to hang on to a completely vertical surface. So spheres just aren't really practical. Cylinders, though, cylinders are excellent. All the homies love a fucking cylinder. Now, there's some interesting considerations insofar as how much gravity you want to give this cylinder, and therefore how fast you'll have to spin it, and also how big it's going to have to be. Alright, since a cross-section of a cylinder is a circle, let's just think about a circle for now, and then we can just extend it into a cylinder later on. So the first and most obvious thing to notice is that the faster the rotation rate, the more artificial gravity you're going to experience. That's probably quite intuitive. I imagine you can see how that would be the case. But also notice, if you keep the same spin rate, but you increase the diameter of the circle, now a point on the circle is going to have to travel further to make one rotation, which means it's going to have to move faster. So this shows us quite clearly that there's a difference between the RPM of the circle and the tangential velocity of the circle, right? These are not the same thing. If we're physically building a space station and we want to rotate it, the faster we rotate it, the more stress is going to be put on the material that we make it out of, and therefore the stronger stuff we need to make it out of in order for it to actually be structurally sound. Funnily, the relationship between the desired artificial gravity that you're trying to create and the angular velocity and circle radius that that's going to require means that if, for example, you want to create a 1G environment and you have a circle of a certain size moving at a certain speed that's calibrated correctly to produce that, if you increase the diameter of the circle and still maintain 1G, the RPM is going to be less, but the tangential speed is going to be more because those two variables scale at different speeds. Like, for example, if you have an object on a string that's like something you can hold in your hand, say it's like a yo-yo or something, and you want to spin spin this yo-yo fast enough that the yo-yo is experiencing 1G. I've said the word yo-yo too much, it sounds weird now. If you compare the yo-yo to some really big, say 1 kilometer wide rotating space habitat, the space habitat is going to be going at a much slower RPM compared to how quickly you're going to have to be whipping this yo-yo around in order to create the experience of 1G. But if you actually measured how fast the velocity of the yo-yo itself is versus the tangential sideways velocity of floor level on that space station, the space station would actually be moving significantly faster. Essentially, it just looks slower because it's bigger. Actually, that's just going to confuse people more because its RPM is legitimately lower. That just doesn't equal tangential velocity. You know what I mean? Anyway, there's a few things we've got to calibrate in our design to make sure that the design works. First and foremost, we need to make sure that the material we make it out of is strong enough to withstand the spinning. This is why making something like an actual real-life halo ring would be very difficult, because you'd have to spin something like that very, very fast and put a lot of stress on the material. So not only do you need a lot of material to make a big thing, but you also can't just make it out of some simple material. It needs to be more and more specialized the bigger the rotating station is that you're building. The second thing to notice is that since the amount of perceived artificial gravity varies based on your distance from the central axis of rotation, any object inside of the station that has some height, such as a person standing up, is going to perceive a difference in artificial gravity between where their feet are and where their head is, because your head is closer to the axis of rotation. So ideally, we want the station to be big enough that that difference isn't really perceivable. Technically, anytime you stand up on Earth, there's a difference in gravity between your feet and your head, but it's small enough that you don't notice. The difference in our station is likely to be much bigger than that, but if we can make the station big enough, we could get that difference to be low enough that you don't notice it. And what would be even better is to be able to make the station big enough that you don't get any weird Coriolis effects on the scale of things that humans are doing inside of the station. For example, if you throw a ball up in the air and try and catch it again, depending on how big the station is and how high you throw it, the ball might curve in unexpected ways. Sorry to interrupt, this is just a quick message to say, statistically speaking, you're probably not subscribed, so I'll make you a deal. Press the subscribe button and I won't come over to your house and do this. Alright, thanks. Back to the video. Another thing to bear in mind when it comes to the rotation itself is that if it's possible to see outside, like say your space station is in low Earth orbit and there are big windows in the space station so you can see the Earth and the moon and the sun and the stars rotating outside of the station, if that's happening too quickly, it could become quite disorienting. It also depends how big the windows are as well. This is less of an issue if the habitat doesn't have windows, but it is something to bear in mind, particularly for habitats on the smaller side. Really what you'd want ideally is a rotation of 1 RPM or less, and the slower you can get that RPM, the less disorienting it's going to be. Potentially helps as well if we don't necessarily need 1G. If we could put up with half a G or a third of a G, that also makes things easier. It means we can lower the stress we're putting on the structure and not have everything be super disorienting if there are windows, but it depends on exactly what you're going to use this structure for. Anyway, that's enough background. Let's talk about the different designs that we can have. First up, structural materials. This is probably the biggest engineering challenge involved, aside from just acquiring the raw materials in the first place and getting them into space where they need to be. A cylinder is going to experience enormous stress from the rotation, so we need something that's going to be able to put up with that. Fortunately, modern high-strength steels are surprisingly kind of fine for this. Pretty much ordinary steel could support cylinders several kilometers in radius if the wall thickness is sufficient, and we can push that further by using even stronger material. Of course, it's going to need to be strong in tension. So for example, concrete is really good in compression, steel is really good in tension, and that's why if we're making bridges and skyscrapers and stuff, we tend to use reinforced concrete, which is just concrete with steel inside of it, so it has the compression strength from the concrete and the tension strength from the steel. In this case, the walls of the station are pretty much just going to be in tension, so that's the primary thing to worry about. Lucky for us, the place that we're probably going to be getting a lot of these resources from in order to enable the construction of these cylindrical habitats is the moon, because the moon is right there, and it's pretty easy to get material off of the moon, and the moon has quite a lot of iron lying around. Further into the future, you could do this even easier by using iron-rich asteroids, but that's a little further off in the future, so we'll get there though. As mentioned earlier, something else we could consider is windows. One of the classic designs for cylinder habitats like this has these big strip windows running along the entire length of the cylinder. In fact, the classic design is a little bit like the Citadel from Mass Effect. If you're familiar with that, you'll know that it has this kind of petal design that opens. If you had a cylinder habitat with opaque sections and window sections, and then had these big panels that open up with mirrors on them, those mirrors could reflect sunlight into the interior of the space station. This has the benefit of being a passive way to get light into the station, and also potentially helps regulate the internal temperature of the station a little bit. The idea is that those mirror panels can either lie flat or open out, depending on whether you want to simulate daytime or nighttime in the station. I do think this approach looks really cool. The vibes are definitely spectacular. Whenever I come back to thinking about these again, I always think that since the station's rotating, the apparent position of the sun will be moving around all over the place, and therefore shadows will be moving rapidly and erratically, which is going to be really disorienting. But that's not actually true if you angle the station properly. The idea is that you point the station at the sun, and then since the sun is effectively at infinity, so all the light rays are coming in parallel, when you gradually open up those mirrors in the simulated morning, even though the station is rotating, the apparent location of the sun is basically at the center of that rotation, so the sun appears stationary even if the rest of the sky is moving around it, and the mirrors reflect that image of the sun at the center of the axis of rotation, so it appears to be stationary unless you change the angle of the mirrors. So if you slowly open the mirrors out throughout the course of a day and then slowly close them again, it actually does a fairly good job of simulating a day-night cycle without the lighting situation being disorienting. But there's a lot of downsides to it as well. You can't really do anything on the glass panels because you need to reserve them for being space where light can come in. They're going to create weak points in the structure of the station. Exactly how well this is going to work to get rid of excess heat depends on a lot of factors, so we can't really say how good this is going to be for that application at this stage. And probably most critically, the reason why it was designed this way was largely because when this design was first produced, LEDs didn't exist, but they do now. So a couple of alternate ways that you could go about producing lighting inside of the station are to either point one end of the cylindrical station directly at the sun and just have a big window on that end with various mirrors inside of the station to try and reflect the light as evenly as possible to all the different parts of the interior, and then you can just open or close an aperture on that end of the station to simulate a day-night cycle. Or you could actually not have any windows at all, completely close the whole thing off, and just have a bar running along the axis inside of the station covered in very strong LEDs, and you just turn the LEDs on or off depending on what time of the day you want it to be. You could even have the LEDs slowly sweep from one end of the station to the other over the course of a day and change from a kind of golden light in the morning to whitish light in the middle of the day to a nice warm orange at sunset. All these different approaches are viable. The mirror approach is maybe the most spectacular, but is also going to have a lot of moving parts and some structural challenges. Just having a bar of LEDs running through the axis is probably going to be the least problematic from an engineering perspective, but is also maybe slightly more boring. So it just depends what you want to optimize for. Something else to consider is the atmosphere and the climate that's going to exist inside one of these things. The atmosphere itself is going to weigh millions of tons, and we've got to make basic decisions such as how much do we want to pressurize it. A human can survive at like 1/3 of the pressure we have at sea level, especially if the oxygen content is increased. That's going to reduce structural stress, but then maybe also cause other problems. And depending on the pressure and the temperature and the humidity, you're going to get different types of cloud formation inside the cylinder. That's all something to consider. It's also something that you can vary. You could potentially decide what you want the weather to be doing. You could probably design a cylinder to be constantly raining on the inside if you wanted to create the independent Republic of Space Scotland. In terms of thermal control for the habitat, the millions of residents one of these things are likely to have are going to generate an enormous amount of waste heat. So you're going to need some very large radiator panels on the outside of the station. You might basically want to make radiators about the same size as the area on which people are living on the inside, because one thing that you don't want to happen is to cook everyone alive on the inside. Something to bear in mind as well is how self-sufficient you want this to be. A permanent habitat should probably be able to recycle pretty much everything and live independently if it stopped being able to access the outside for one reason or another. So you're going to need your carbon and nitrogen and water cycles all to be a self-contained functional thing. Ideally, you're probably going to want to create all of your food on board as well. You could use traditional fields for this, but that uses up quite a lot of surface area. You do see a lot of the concept art for these kind of things showing natural landscapes, but I wonder if some kind of hydroponics or aeroponics or aquaponics would be a better approach. You know, rather than big horizontal fields, make vertical skyscrapers where you just grow food as efficiently as possible. Hopefully by this point in the future we'll also be able to grow meat, so you shouldn't have to have fields of physical animals either. The internal architecture, you know, whether you go for a natural looking environment or an urban looking environment, is pretty much up to you. You could just go for natural looking fields and farmland and stuff if you want. Depends on the purpose of the space habitat. These things could have similar land area to like an entire country on Earth, so entire habitats could just be wildlife reserves. For the landscape itself, if you wanted to create artificial mountains and stuff like that, there are sort of two approaches that you can take. You could physically dent the structure of the habitat itself. That would to some degree weaken the structural integrity of the habitat, but it would also be a very lightweight way of doing it. You know, you just have a really thin layer of dirt or rocks or whatever on top of what is ultimately just the exterior of the structure, or you could actually just fill the interior of the cylinder with the material to create the landscape. Now, these cylinder habitats are relatively sensitive to weight distribution. Ideally, you'd like to keep things roughly spread out. If you have all of the weight at one end of the structure, it could make the cylinder start wobbling in weird ways. So if you don't want to make dents in the exterior of the habitat, you're going to want to use a very lightweight filler material that you can just form into the shape of a mountain or a hill. Something like a lightweight lattice structure or aerogel or something like that. And then again, lay a kind of natural surface over the top of it to make it look like a regular mountain. Although an approach I think is a little bit underutilized in the concept designs for these things is a high-density urban environment, particularly one across multiple different levels. Even if you wanted to retain the whole sunlight situation and not have the structure just be a series of vertically stacked corridors, which would be very boring. Like if you wanted to have the entire thing look like a city, basically like the Citadel in Mass Effect, I think you could do that, material strength permitting, but not only have skyscrapers, but actually have smaller cylinders or rings within the main cylinder. If you did that, then different heights of skyscraper and different suspended sections within the habitat would have different levels of artificial gravity. So if you wanted to play some kind of sport that's only possible in low gravity, you could just go up to a ring section nearer the axis and play it there. Of course, at the axis itself, you would be completely weightless. And funnily, because the artificial gravity is only being generated by the rotation of the station, if you get to the axis of rotation, so you're just floating there stationary next to this like central lighting beam or whatever, and then you push yourself off from it and you slowly float down towards the edge of the cylinder, you actually wouldn't gradually fall faster and faster towards the edge. You'd gently float up to it, but it would be whizzing past you due to its tangential velocity, which could still be quite a dangerous thing, because I guess you just slowly drift into a very fast-moving surface that's basically going to belt sand you with terrain, or you might just get hit by a passing skyscraper. That's also probably not going to be great for your health. Let's talk about entering and exiting one of these cylinders, because the cylinder's pressurized and space obviously isn't, so there's going to need to be some kind of airlock between space and the habitat. Probably the most sensible thing to do is similar to the docking scene in 2001: A Space Odyssey, or the way that you dock in Elite Dangerous, where you go in through the axis. In this instance, there will be a door that opens, you fly your spaceship in, it closes behind you, and at this point the spaceship is floating inside of a closed room, and the air gets pumped into the room, and then another door opens, and the spaceship can gently push itself into the habitat and dock somewhere along that central axis. Or you could just leave the spaceship in the airlock and just have the people go into the main body of the habitat itself. Sometimes I enjoy thinking about what it would be like to be a person who enters into a cylinder habitat on the axis, and then assuming that the end caps of the cylinder are conical, trying to walk from the axis down to the main floor of the cylinder. Initially you might think that that would just feel like incrementally more gravity, but I think there'd be some weird trippy centripetal force stuff going on as well. In reality, I think the way that you would actually get down to the surface is there'd be some kind of bus, monorail, elevator type thing. You'd get inside of it, you'd probably sit down and strap yourself in, and it would move you on a rail down the axis a little while, and then, like a lift or an elevator, it'd slowly lower you down to the main body of the cylinder. Again, I think you'd have to strap in for this because there'd be some weird centripetal force stuff as you're descending or ascending. One thing we haven't discussed yet is the attitude control system. As mentioned, these things are quite sensitive to weight distribution, and the fact that they're spinning makes them subject to gyroscopic effects. Objects spinning on certain axes can be subject to some weird sudden onset instability issues. If you were to build one cylinder habitat on its own, you'd probably want a system of several redundant, very, very large momentum wheels that you can use to counteract any weird torques going on. But obviously, if those are big enough and dense enough that they have the mass needed to control the attitude of the entire space station, they're going to be expensive to create, right? They've got a lot of matter in them, right? You've got to create these giant pieces of steel that are going to have to spin in various ways. So since that's going to be quite a big draw on resources anyway, what you could do is, instead of having one cylinder with a bunch of systems specifically for attitude control, you could have two counter-rotating cylinder habitats attached together. If they're counter-rotating, so they're going in opposite directions, right? One's going clockwise and the other one's going counterclockwise, those weird gyroscopic effects will tend to cancel each other out. You'd still want additional attitude control systems, but at least part of the issue kind of solves itself. You can just ever so slightly tweak the spin rate of each individual cylinder to keep the whole thing nice and stable. Or I mean, you can just have one cylinder and a really substantial attitude control system if you really wanted to, but again, depends what you're going for. It'd probably be a good idea to keep some kind of thrusters on board, because at some point you're going to have to spin one or both of those cylinders in a way that you don't really want to. You're going to compensate with reaction wheels, but then those reaction wheels are going to become saturated, so you're going to have to compensate for those by actually expelling mass, so you can spin down the reaction wheels again so that you can continue to use them. This does intrinsically mean that it's not going to be a completely self-sufficient system, because by definition you're removing things from the system. But to a degree, the existence of these kind of cylindrical habitats kind of implies the existence of some very substantial cislunar industry, at least, if not some kind of interplanetary industry. So hopefully that's not a huge deal, and you'd be fine for a while, but exactly how long goes by before you really do need some fuel is just going to depend on how efficient your attitude control system is. To power that attitude control system and everything else on board, you're going to need some power source, right? This is something I'm calling out, although I don't really have any specifics because it depends on exactly when we're doing this and what the level of technology is that we have access to. But options include solar panels, nuclear fission, nuclear fusion. I suppose you could just build a big wheel and fill it with hamsters if you really wanted to. I think the last big thing to consider is how you protect the cylindrical habitat from radiation and debris. See, in media they tend to be depicted with the outer shell just being exposed, but there's a decent chance that in reality, particularly if you were doing the version that doesn't have windows in it, that you just cover the entire thing in raw material. Nothing special or specific, literally just rough, unprocessed bits of moon or asteroid, just to act as a barrier between the habitat and outer space. If you had a counter-rotating double cylinder setup, I have wondered, and I don't know if this is something you would actually do or not, but I've wondered if you could put both of them inside of a bigger capsule-shaped structure, which then potentially you could fill with rough material. That entire setup could be considered one module, and if you make lots of them, you can attach them together in a triangular lattice structure, making this sort of infinitely expandable modular gigastructure, which is what my wife calls my wiener. That was a lie, I don't have a wife. I'm sure you could also design these in such a way that they could connect to each other longitudinally. Longitudinally. Why can I not say that? You know what I mean. Anyway, that pretty much sums it up. Now go ahead and build me an O'Neill cylinder. And in the meantime, I'm going to build up the ego of my elite level supporters. Thunderbolt 22A10, who once tried to sail around Ceres, but wind hadn't been invented yet. Nomad Greg, who huffed the gases out of a black hole that consumed galactic Taco Bell. Andrew Mole, who was born in Space Australia, more specifically Space Brisbane. Go Space Broncos! JB Jaron, who once inhaled a small Portuguese man. JDK, who's so thick the clap of his cheeks could destroy a small town. Mutantious Doom, who ate a bowl of nails for breakfast this morning without any milk. Nikita Lurie, whose party trick is making this noise with his feet. Aaron Rowe, who stopped at the Grand Canyon for a bathroom break on their way to a petrol station. Bonk Chunk, who escaped the tyranny of matter. That one boy, who went around dipping babies in buckets of paint. Trenton Caldwell, whose favourite British meal is frog in a frozen vegetable bag. Jimbo Quiz, whose middle name is Skadoosh. Draco91, who subscribes to The Economist but only for the lewd photos. Surreal Melody, who has scientifically proven that all Game of Thrones characters are secretly horses. Enoch Trismegistus, who has 6 sons, 5 of whom are named Jeff. And thanks to all my other supporters too. Don't forget to join the Patreon or the channel membership if you want to be featured in my video credits or chat on the Discord. And as always, I'll catch you in the next one. Over and out.